Hi all, AD here from Haunts and Jaunts. As always, thank you so much for clicking on today's video. Today I'm in deepest, darkest Dorset and I'm at this tiny little church over here called Saint Edwold's, and we're in a tiny little place called Stockwood. So let's go and have a look. I think we're going to have to climb over this fence actually to get to it, and it's accessed via a little footpath. So yeah, it should be really cute. Let's go. Hidden away down a quiet country lane in rural Dorset stands one of the smallest churches in England. Welcome to Saint Edwald's Church in Stockwood. It's a tiny medieval church that has quietly watched over the countryside for centuries. At first glance, it almost looks like a cottage rather than a church. In fact, the entire building measures only about 9 metres long and less than 4 metres wide, so that's roughly the size of a single-decker bus. And despite its modest dimensions, this little place has a long and fascinating history. The church sits in the small hamlet of Stockwood beneath the wooded slopes of Bub Down in the Dorset countryside. Today the area is peaceful and remote, but in the past it was home to a small rural community that relied on this church as the centre of parish life. Saint Edwald's is widely regarded as the smallest church in Dorset and one of the smallest parish churches anywhere in England, but the building we see today is not necessarily the first church to have stood here. One of the most unusual things about this church is its dedication, and instead of being named after a widely known saint like Mary or Peter, this church honours Saint Edwald, who's a relatively obscure figure from the early medieval period. Edwald lived during the 9th century and was the brother of Edmund the Martyr, the Anglo-Saxon king who was killed by Viking invaders in the year 870. According to tradition, after Edmund's death, Edwald was offered the throne of East Anglia, but he refused. Instead of becoming king, he chose a life of solitude and prayer, travelling south to live as a hermit in Dorset, and he is believed to have lived not far from here. Some historians even believe he may have spent some of his time living as a hermit here at Stockwood itself, and if that is true, it would explain why this tiny church carries his name and why it remains the only church in Dorset dedicated to him. The church building that survives today mostly dates from the 15th century. It's constructed from local rubble stone and originally would have served the small farming community that lived in the area. But unlike many parish churches which have separate sections like a nave and a chancel, Saint Edwald's is built as a single cell church. That means that the entire interior is just one small space where the congregation would gather together. But over the centuries, the building saw a few changes. In 1636, builders added the small porch on the west end of the church where we came in, and at the same time they installed the distinctive circular bell turret above it. And the little turret is one of the church's most charming features. But resting on short columns and topped with a rounded cap, it almost looks decorative rather than practical. But it once housed the church bell that would have called parishioners to worship. And inside the church, the furnishings are very simple. Most of what we see today, including the pews and the font, which we'll have a closer look at in a moment, are actually from the 19th century. And the altar is actually older than that, but it was brought in from another Dorset church. But the simplicity of this interior reflects the humble rural community that once gathered here. For many centuries, Stockwood was its own parish and it would have had its own priest, but as time passed, the population of the hamlet gradually declined, and by the late 19th century, the parish was merged with neighbouring communities, and Saint Edwald's was no longer needed for regular services. In 1959, the church was officially declared redundant, and buildings like this often fall into ruin once they're no longer used, but Saint Edwald's was fortunate, and it was eventually placed in the care of the Church's Conservation Trust, which is a charity that preserves historic churches across England that are no longer used for regular worship. And thanks to their work, the church has been carefully protected and still remains open to visitors today. The church sits beside a farmhouse and is approached by crossing a small footbridge, which we went across on the way in, and that crosses over stream before walking through the field into the churchyard. It feels really peaceful, secluded and almost unchanged by time here, and there's this beautiful yew tree just on the edge of the bank of the stream, so I just went over to obviously give it a hug and embrace some of that beautiful ancient energy. The churchyard itself is tiny and it's only got a handful of graves, and it's a reminder of just how small the parish community once was. We'll have a look at a couple of the headstones, but unfortunately they're so weathered it was almost impossible to read any of the lettering on there. The church is so tiny, its space was so compact, and probably only a few dozen people could ever have gathered in there at once. Yet for centuries, this beautiful little church was the spiritual heart of the community. And I think about the farmers, labourers and local families who would have come here for baptisms, weddings and funerals, marking the most important moments of their lives within those stone walls. Across England there are thousands of historic parish churches. Some are large cathedrals visited by millions, others like Saint Edwold's are small, quiet places tucked away in the countryside. But these smaller churches often feel the most personal. They remind us of the rural communities that once shaped the English landscape and of the people whose lives revolved around buildings just like this. And in the case of Saint Edwald's, they also connect us to a story from more than 1,000 years ago of a prince who turned down a crown in favour of a life of faith and solitude. So if you ever find yourself exploring the Dorset countryside, it's well worth seeking out this tiny church beneath the hills, because within its small stone walls lies a surprisingly large piece of history. And there's that beautiful bell tower. So cute. And can you make out the little face there as well? Thank you so much for watching. I really do hope you enjoyed it. Wasn't it absolutely gorgeous, and in such a beautiful idyllic location? If you did enjoy today's video, if you could please like and subscribe and hit the hype button if you've got one underneath. If you do want to help my channel a little bit more, you can hit the buy me a coffee link down below, and that helps me out a bit because I always make a contribution to these churches and buildings that I visit. But if you'd like to make a contribution directly, you can do so. For this particular one, it's under the care of the Church's Conservation Trust, and I love the work that they do, and I'll pop their link in the description below. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you for the next one. It might be a haunt, it might be a jaunt, who knows. Bye for now.